The echo of footsteps, a scream at dusk, and a courtyard stained by secrets. Welcome to Mystery Parlor. I am your host, Axon. Tell me, where in the world are you joining this mystery from? Your thoughts and locations light up the channel. Let's begin. It had been raining all night. The rain had stopped now, but the air still smelled of wet stones and soot, and the pavements glistened with a dull sheen that made them look older than they were. Maigret stood by the open window of his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, a pipe cooling in his hand, his large frame slouched slightly, not from weariness but from habit. He had woken early, too early for any real purpose, and now stood watching the awakening of the street below, a delivery cart passing with wooden wheels echoing faintly in the morning quiet, a concierge swilling down the pavement outside a bakery, a woman tugging a child roughly toward the metro. Madame Maigret was still in the kitchen, humming faintly as she prepared coffee. He could smell the rich, dark scent of it mingling with the cleaner smell of rain. It comforted him in a way he wouldn't name. There had been no urgent calls from the Quai d'Orfèvres, and he hoped it would stay that way for another hour at least. He took a long breath through his nose, slow and silent, and leaned his forearm on the window's worn wooden sill. The telephone rang. Not the office line, not the shrill bureaucratic bark of a duty call from headquarters. This was the low, deliberate ring of the household telephone, and that meant something else. He closed the window, slowly, without haste, as though completing the gesture of watching the street before turning to whatever the day would demand. He didn't speak until the second ring after he'd picked up the receiver. Maigret. The voice on the other end was hesitant, low, a woman's voice, older, not quite trembling, but uncertain, as if rehearsing how to speak to him while already speaking. Is this Chief Inspector Maigret? Yes, my name is Madame Chap. I don't know if you remember me. You came once, years ago, when my husband's shop was burgled. Maigret's face did not change. He remembered nothing about a Madame Chap. There had been so many shops, so many minor incidents, people who expected miracles from a police inspector, and later forgot he'd come at all. I remember the case, he said gently, lying with the softness of routine. I wouldn't call unless it felt. I'm sure you get these things all the time, but something is wrong. In the courtyard. What sort of wrong? A tenant. He hasn't come out for 2 days. And last night, I heard something like a fall. I knocked. No one answered. It's not like him. He has habits. Maigret's silence invited more. She offered none. Her voice had tightened. She had said what she could. He jotted the address, Rue du Marche Popincourt, number 17, and told her he would come by. He did not ask her to call the local precinct. He would go himself, not out of urgency, but because something about her tone had struck a curious note. It was not fear, not quite, a sort of quiet conviction that things were no longer as they should be. He hung up and stood for a moment. Madame Maigret brought his coffee in a white porcelain cup. He took it without a word, sipped it, and looked down at his shoes. He did not want to leave yet, but he knew he would. She waited a few seconds before speaking. Not the office, no. A murder. He shrugged. Probably not. A tenant who hasn't come out for 2 days. That could be many things. It could. He agreed. He finished the coffee, set the cup down, and reached for his coat and hat. It was not far. The Rue du Marche Popincourt curled like a forgotten string behind the larger boulevards, its shops half-shuttered, its buildings wearing a face of Paris that did not care to change with the times. At number 17, a wide archway led into a cobbled courtyard, worn smooth by years of feet and bicycle tires. A single iron lantern hung near the entrance, unlit, rust collecting at its base. The rain had not yet dried from the cobblestones, and Maigret paused there for a moment, breathing in the dampness, looking not at the buildings, but at the windows. They were all the same shape, with peeling white shutters and flower pots balanced on thin ledges, yet each window carried a different story. Blinds crooked, curtains drawn, glass clouded. He moved slowly toward the small concierge window beside the entrance, where a light burned and Madame Chap waited. She was smaller than he imagined, almost bird-like in build, with eyes that didn't match her voice, sharper, darker, less hesitant. Her apron had flour on it. You're alone? She asked. He nodded. I didn't want to make a fuss, But it's the third floor, left staircase. His name is Monsieur Vincent Faber. He's a translator. Quiet, always pays on time. You hear his typewriter even at night, but not for 2 days. Now, Maigret followed her pointing finger up to the windows above. Closed shutters, no sound, no movement. He asked quietly, anyone else take notice? No one says much around here. Everyone keeps to themselves. That's how it is now. He thanked her with a nod and moved inside. Through a stairwell that smelled of stone and oil and boiled cabbage from somewhere above. His feet made no sound on the stairs. He took his time, stopping once between floors, listening, nothing. At the third floor, the corridor was dim, one bulb flickering overhead. The door to the left bore a faded brass plaque, Vincent Faber, Traductions. A pair of shoes rested neatly beside it. Not damp. Maigret knocked. Once, twice. Nothing. He bent slightly, feeling the wood of the door with his palm. Cool. He crouched and peered at the crack under the frame. A thin trail of something dark, almost invisible in the dim light. He stood and nodded once to himself for still. He waited a moment longer before taking out his pocket knife and slipping it into the door jamb. The old lock gave without much resistance. A soft, reluctant click, and the door creaked open an inch, like something yielding unwillingly to the world outside. Maigret paused before pushing it further. The air that escaped was still and faintly stale, with a trace of something else, not the sharpness of decay, not yet, but the sourness of time held too long in place. He stepped inside. The apartment was small, tidy, and dim. Thin morning light filtered through the shutters, casting a gray-blue hue on the walls. A coat hung on a peg by the door. A pair of gloves lay folded on the narrow console table, beside a closed notebook and a fountain. Pen, nothing seemed out of place. Yet the stillness was wrong. Maigret moved quietly into the main room, his eyes adjusting. A typewriter sat on a writing desk near the window, the carriage halfway across. A sheet still clamped in place, half filled with typed text, on a tray beside it. A coffee cup with a dark ring at the bottom, a spoon beside it. It had not been. Cleared away, his eyes drifted to the far corner, and then stopped. Vincent Faber was there, seated in a threadbare armchair facing the wall. His body leaned slightly forward, as if caught in mid-thought, yet unmistakably still. His chin touched his chest, his arms rested limp on either side of the chair. One slippered foot pointed awkwardly outward, at an angle no living foot would. Find natural. Maigret stepped closer, his breath slow and quiet. There was no question Faber was dead. The man's face was pale, waxy, his mouth slightly open, as though interrupted mid-sentence. His eyes were closed. No sign of struggle, no wound, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest violence. And yet, the inspector knelt and looked closer at the floor beneath the chair. That same faint trail he had glimpsed outside the door was here, beneath Faber's right hand, leading back across the parquet floor toward the small kitchen. It was brownish, tacky-looking, not blood, something darker, dried. Ink, coffee. Maigret followed it. In the kitchen, the light was better. A cloth had been dropped on the floor near the sink. He picked it up with 2 fingers and sniffed. Vinegar. He opened the small trash bin. Nothing unusual. A cracked eggshell, a heel of bread, a crumpled shopping receipt. He returned to the living room and stood for a long moment, looking not at the body but at the room around it. It was a bachelor's apartment, but a meticulous one. Bookshelves in careful order, nothing decorative, but nothing neglected. A faint scent of tobacco. Faber must have smoked, though Maigret saw no ashtray. In a small alcove near the desk, a narrow bed, made tightly, no signs of a struggle. No broken glass, no misplaced furniture, no panic, just a dead man sitting in an armchair, as though sleep had claimed him too gently. And yet Maigret felt that same quiet chord of wrongness reverberating under the surface. He stepped back into the corridor and closed the door gently behind him. The hallway was still empty. He descended the stairs slowly, letting each step echo. In the courtyard, Madame Chappe was standing under the archway, smoking a cigarette. She looked up at his face before he even spoke and knew. He's dead, isn't he? Maigret nodded. How? Well, did you know him? The concierge flicked ash into a saucer she had brought with her. Not very, quiet, always polite. Paid on time, as I said. Lived alone. No visitors, not that I saw. He'd go out mornings. I assumed to cafes, libraries, wherever translators go. Come back mid-afternoon. Never caused trouble. Anyone ever come to see him? Once in a while. A woman, maybe twice a month. Never stayed long. Do you know her name? No. She didn't speak to me. Mid-30s, well-dressed, but discreet. She didn't come last week, that I remember. Maigret glanced around the courtyard. Two cats stretched along the windowsills. A bicycle leaned against a drainpipe. Two men were talking low in a window above. They disappeared when they noticed Maigret looking up. He turned back to Madame. Chap, who else lives on the 3rd floor? Left stair, next to Faber, old Monsieur Tardy. Retired postman. Nearly deaf. Across from him, the Lemerchen family. Young couple, small child. He works nights at the railway. She's home most of the time. Right staircase has Madame Combe. Widow, keeps to herself, and a student, name of Prawn, Maigret. Nodded and made a mental note. I'll have to speak to them all. Of course. She hesitated. Then said, do you think, was it natural? That's what I'll need to find out. He stepped aside and lit his pipe, more from habit than desire, and stood silently watching the slow breath of the courtyard. Somewhere a window creaked open. A door latch clicked. Already the building was reacting, in quiet ways, the way apartments do when something shifts in their familiar pattern. He made his way to the Lemerchan's door first, but paused before knocking. Not yet. He preferred to let the dust settle a little, to observe before questioning, to wait until nerves settled into routine again. He turned instead and climbed to the floor above Faber's. He found the landing quiet, the doors shut. At the far end, someone's radio played faintly. A newsreader's voice bleating about an accident in Montrouge. No one came out. He didn't. Knocked out on the way down. He passed the 2nd floor and saw the same thing. Closed doors, quiet windows, life behind paper-thin barriers. He stopped only once, noticing a broken tile on the step, recently cracked. It told him nothing, but he noted it anyway when he returned to the courtyard. He saw a man had entered, small-framed, in his 40s, wearing a wool coat too heavy for spring. He stood speaking quietly with Madame Chap. She pointed toward Maigret. The man approached. I'm Michel Prawn, he said, from the right staircase, 3rd floor. I heard there was something wrong. Maigret studied him. The man's shoes were wet, but not muddy. His hands trembled slightly, though it was not cold. We found Monsieur Faber dead. Maigret said simply. Oh, Prawn breathed. I only saw him once or twice. He seemed decent. You live directly above him? Yes. Did you hear anything the last day or two? Prawn thought for a long moment. No, nothing odd. Though, yesterday morning, I thought I heard something drop. A bang, maybe, not loud. Could have been anything. And before that, the man shook his head. He worked a lot, always typing. Maigret nodded. Where do you work, monsieur? Prawn, law student. I work evenings at a bookshop. Maigret offered his hand. Thank you. The man shook it, his palm cool and dry. He glanced toward the stairwell again, hesitated, then returned upstairs. Maigret watched him go. Another ordinary man, another small truth, another thread to tuck away. He turned once more toward the concierge. I'll need to wait for the doctor, he said. Then the boys from the lab. But I don't think this will be a simple case. She didn't ask why, and Maigret didn't explain that it was not the silence in the apartment that troubled him. It was how complete it had been. The medical examiner arrived just after midday. A small, soft-spoken man named Dr. Vernou, who had worked with Maigret often enough to read his silences. They spoke little. Vernou spent a long time with the body while Maigret stood at the window, pipe unlit between his teeth, watching the courtyard below. Outside, the courtyard had returned to its hush. A woman shook a rug over the railing. A boy in suspenders wheeled a bicycle through the arch and stopped when he saw the police van parked outside, staring up with a mixture of fear and fascination. No one lingered long. The building had drawn itself inward again. Nothing obvious, Vernu said at last, wiping his hands. No wound. No bruising. He could have died in his sleep, you'd think. But his pulse would not have stopped cleanly like this. Maigret looked over. Poison. Possibly. Something quiet. Something quick. If so, it's well chosen. I'll know more after the examination. But there's no external sign. No vomiting. No convulsions. Just stillness. He was seated when it happened, likely. The posture suggests. So he didn't fall. He just ceased. Maigret nodded. Any estimate on the time? Yesterday afternoon or evening, perhaps. It wasn't long. The body hasn't stiffened too much. Room temperature helped preserve that. Thank you, doctor. Vernu packed his bag, patted his coat into place, and gave one last look at the body. It's quiet deaths like these that make me nervous. The body gives up nothing. It makes you feel like you're intruding. Maigret offered no reply. He waited for the medical team to remove the body and then walked the apartment again, slowly, as if the absence of Faber might whisper more than his presence had. The typewriter stood as before, the half-written page locked under its arm. The words were mundane. A letter, perhaps, a translation. A second sheet sat folded nearby, with marginal notes in blue ink. A phrase circled, desire can distort. Intention. He tucked the page into his coat pocket without unfolding it further. In the kitchen. He poured water into a glass and stared at it for a moment before drinking. There were no family photographs, no postcards, no calendar, a life without decoration. And yet everything had been kept, not as if the man were lonely, but as if he were careful. He stepped outside again, to the courtyard, where Madame Chap still stood sentinel. I'll speak to the others now, he said. She nodded. He went to the Lemerchan's apartment. The young mother answered, wiping her hands on a dishcloth, her small son clinging to her leg. Her name was Elise. Her husband, Michel, worked nights at the Gare de Lyon, managing cargo. She herself rarely left the building except to shop. I didn't know Monsieur Faber, she said. We nodded if we passed on the stairs. He never smiled. Not unfriendly, just heavy, like he was thinking about something else. Maigret sat in the modest sitting room, letting her speak in her own rhythm. He watched the boy draw with crayons on the carpet. The apartment smelled of milk and soap. I sometimes heard his typewriter late, she added. He typed fast. Then suddenly he'd stop. I always imagined he was deciding something important. Did he have visitors? Rarely. There was a woman once, I think. I heard her voice once or twice. Sharp voice, not cruel, just clipped. She smoked. You smelled it. She nodded. Strong perfume. 2. I remember. Did you hear anything unusual yesterday? She shook her head. Only that he wasn't typing. That was odd. Now that you mention it, it felt too quiet. He thanked her and left gently, making sure the child wasn't frightened. He had learned that people told more when you made them feel. Normal. Next, he went to the apartment of Monsieur Tardy, the nearly deaf former postman. The man opened the door before Maigret knocked, apparently alerted by the sound of shoes in the hall. You're the inspector, he bellowed. I thought you might be. They sat near the window. Tardy spoke loudly and with the certainty of the elderly. I knew Faber only by sight. Thin fellow, always wore a scarf even in spring. We never spoke. Did you hear anything yesterday? Tardy scratched his chin. Here, I'm mostly deaf, monsieur. But sometimes I feel things through the floor. Vibrations, you understand. Yesterday, no, nothing at all. Have you ever seen anyone visiting him? No one except the woman. Dark hair, sharp nose. Carried a briefcase. That's how I remember her. The briefcase, not a handbag. Maigret nodded. It matched the description so far. Do you know her name? No idea, but she wasn't the sort to talk to concierge. Tardy smiled faintly, as if proud of that judgment. On his way out, Maigret stood once more in the middle of the stairwell, listening. There was no movement. He climbed the other staircase to where Madame Combe lived. She opened the door hesitantly, her cardigan buttoned wrong. A scarf knotted too tightly round her neck. Her eyes were small and watchful. Yes, I'm Chief Inspector Maigret. May I come in? She looked at him for a long second, then stepped aside. The flat was dark, curtains drawn, a shrine-like stillness inside, a table of family photographs. sat beneath a lace cloth. She spoke little. No, she didn't know Faber. No, she hadn't heard anything. She had her own troubles, arthritis. Her son who no longer wrote from Toulon. She said it all without bitterness, just as a fact of life. As he turned to go, she said, he had sadness in him, that one. You knew him better than you say. I watched. It's what the old do. He nodded and left without pressing further. The last stop was Perrin's apartment. The man was seated on a narrow balcony with a book in his lap, as if expecting him. You're thorough, he said with a thin smile. I have to be, Maigret replied. Prawn invited him inside, offered a drink, which Maigret declined. The apartment was cleaner than before, but the ashtray held to fresh cigarette butts. Prawn said little that he hadn't already. Faber was not the type to cause trouble, he repeated. But he wasn't harmless. You could tell there was something bristling under the surface, like he'd come through something and never told the whole of it. Maigret leaned slightly forward. What kind of something? Hard to say. But I've met men like that. They wear silence like a uniform. The inspector nodded slowly, stood, and looked out the balcony window at the courtyard again. It was still, but beneath the stillness, a pulse had started. Maigret felt it. The following morning, Paris wore its familiar gray like a shawl. The air was heavy with the promise of rain again, though none had yet fallen. The cobbles of Rue du Marche Popincourt held a dull sheen from yesterday's showers, and the neighborhood resumed its rhythm. Early deliveries, iron shutters rising, with reluctant clangs, and conversations behind cafe windows too low to catch. Maigret sat at his desk at the Quai des Orfèvres. The edges of the file on Vincent Faber opened before him, but not yet disturbed. He had read it earlier, twice, and it told him very little. Faber had no criminal record, no family in the city, a few financial documents, modest accounts, one fixed client with a small legal translation firm near the Rue de la Chaussée-d'Antin. Nothing that would catch the eye of a policeman, and yet something still pressed behind the facts, as if a breath had been held too long. Across from him, Lucas entered without knocking and set down a slip of paper. The lab finished with the apartment, he said. No signs of forced entry. No foreign prints except a set on the glass in the kitchen partial, and they don't match Faber's. Possibly female, no poison residues found in the water. But the doctor's still running stomach contents. They're leaning toward barbiturates. Something, taken orally, possibly slipped into food. Maigret nodded. The typewriter ribbon, fresh, he used it yesterday. The note you gave them is clean. He was writing a letter or essay, maybe even a journal entry. Nothing about visitors. Maigret tapped the bowl of his pipe thoughtfully. Though he didn't light it, the concierge and the tenants mention a woman briefcase, perfume. Cigarettes, Lucas nodded. I tracked down the translation agency he worked with. They sent a Miss Clementine Barus, legal clerk, worked with Faber regularly over the past year. She visited him sometimes for notary work, handoffs, revisions. They say it was a professional relationship. She matched the description perfectly. Maigret stood. Where does she work? Rue de la Chaussée-d'Antin, number 14. A firm called Broussac at Delaunay. Maigret put on his coat. Come with me. The office was on the 4th floor of a narrow, dusky building. The lift had a gate that rattled when closed, and the hallway outside was lined with green linoleum curling at the edges. Inside, the firm was quiet, respectable, the way legal offices often are, full of papers no one reads and names that seem larger than the people who bear them. They were received by a secretary, then ushered into a side room where Clementine Barus waited at a plain desk. She stood when they entered, late 30s, dark hair pinned simply, a navy blouse under a charcoal blazer. Her eyes were watchful, intelligent. She looked as though she anticipated being spoken to without surprise. I'm Chief Inspector Maigret, he said gently. Thank you for seeing us. She gestured to the 2 chairs across from her and sat down only once they had. We're asking questions about Vincent Faber. Yes, she said. Her tone was careful but not cold. I heard this morning. One of our partners saw the paper. It only said he died unexpectedly. But I suspected more. Why? She didn't hesitate. Because nothing about him was accidental. He was precise, orderly. The kind of man who would not fall ill without announcing it first. You knew him well, well enough. I worked with him, editing, notarized translations, official court documents. We met perhaps twice a month, sometimes more if we were on a deadline. Did you visit his home? Several times. He preferred not to use the post for sensitive documents. He worried about confidentiality. Were you close? No, at least not in that way. She glanced at Maigret with a flash of something, amusement, perhaps, or mild irritation. There was respect, but he held a part of himself back. Always, Maigret watched her closely. Did he seem troubled to you? Yes, she said quietly, but not in a dramatic sense, not depressed or frightened. More like unresolved. Something in him was unfinished. He carried it with him. Maigret leaned back slightly. When did you last see him? She thought. 4 days ago. Tuesday afternoon. I brought over a contract from the Court of Appeal. We had tea, talked briefly. He looked tired, but not sick. He asked me if I believed people could change themselves. Truly, not by will, but by need. I told him yes. He said he didn't think so. Did he mention anyone troubling him? Anyone new in his life? She shook her head. No, he rarely spoke about other people. Did he ever seem afraid? No, she said again, firmer this time. He was wary of the world, but not afraid. Maigret opened his coat and removed the folded page from Faber's desk, the one with the circled phrase. He passed it to her. She read it once and her lips pressed together. Yes, that's his writing. That phrase, we talked about it. He was revising a deposition about a contested will. One of the parties had made a claim rooted more in jealousy than law. That's what he said. Desire can distort intention. Do you think that applied to him personally? I think everything he worked on left a trace in him. He was sponge-like that way. Maigret took a moment before speaking again. Would you describe him as lonely? She looked down at her hands. Not in the way most people are. He liked silence. He didn't fear it. He stood. Thank you. Mademoiselle Barousse, you've been helpful. She rose, composed, her arms by her side. Inspector, you believe he was murdered? He met her eyes, don't you? She didn't answer. Her silence was its own confirmation. Outside, on the street, Lucas fell into step beside him. She's clever, he said. She's honest, mostly, Maigret replied. But there's something she didn't say. Not a lie, something left out. Should we keep her under observation? No, Maigret said. She doesn't need pressure. Not yet. People like her talk best when the world has stopped watching. As they turned the corner toward the cafe on the Boulevard Haussmann, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft, hesitant, like a whisper. Maigret tilted his head toward the sky, eyes narrowed, then turned his collar up and walked on. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Faber's final words echoed again, not the typed ones, but the ones passed on by a woman who smelled of cigarettes and tea. The rain continued through the afternoon, steady and unobtrusive. Paris did not resist it. It merely adjusted. Umbrellas bloomed like dark flowers, collars were turned up, and the streets wore their wet sheen with the familiarity of old routine. Maigret stood just inside the entrance of Librairie Sullivan, a narrow bookshop tucked beside a tobacconist on Rue du Bac. The air inside was warmer, dampened with the scent of old paper and recent coffee. The shop was quiet. Shelves towered toward the ceiling, packed with paperbacks and stitched spines, some stacked horizontally. Where space had grown scarce, at the far end, a man in his 40s stood behind a counter, his posture casual but alert. Michel Prawn, the student tenant from Faber's building, wore a gray pullover and rimless spectacles. He looked up and saw Maigret. You found me, he said. No surprise, no tension. I said I would, Maigret replied. Prawn sat down, a copy of L'Étranger, and gestured toward a bench near the window. We rarely get customers in weather like this. Sit down, if you like. Maigret didn't sit. He let his coat drip slowly on the mat and scanned the shelves around him. Art history, Russian poetry, political biographies, and a shelf labeled Étrangers in shaky handwriting. You work here every day? Maigret asked. Afternoons. Yes, from 2 to 7. The owner's mostly retired. He comes in for an hour around midday and leaves before the rain can ruin his hat. And your studies, law. At the Sorbonne. Though lately I find I prefer books that tell the truth, without pretending to. Maigret allowed himself a faint smile. Faber was a man of words too. Did you talk with him? Only twice, once about his typewriter. I needed to borrow ribbon. Another time in the courtyard. We both reached for the same copy of the evening paper and laughed. Did he laugh easily? No, Prawn said, after a pause. That was the only time. Maigret moved slowly through the aisles. You said earlier that Faber seemed like a man who had come through something. What made you say that? Instinct. Prawn replied. His clothes were modest, but always pressed. His shoes were polished even in rain. He carried himself like someone determined not to be noticed. That's not natural. It's cultivated. People only become invisible after wanting to disappear. Do you think he was hiding? I think he had been hurt once. That kind of damage leaves marks, even if it's invisible, like scar tissue. In the voice, Maigret turned. Do you believe someone wanted him dead? I don't know, but people who vanish into themselves don't always do so willingly. There was a silence, broken only by the faint thrum of rain on the awning above the shop's door. Maigret stepped closer to the counter. You're observant. Have you seen anything in the building recently that felt out of rhythm? Prawn considered. A few days before he died, someone came to the building in the late afternoon. I was in the stairwell, and I heard voices behind Faber's door. Low, tense. A woman, not Miss Barus. The voice was different, more familiar, more impatient. You recognized it? No, but there was something domestic about it. Like she had been there before. She didn't knock like a stranger, did you see her? Just a glimpse. Brown hair, shorter than average. Tan coat. She left quickly. Didn't wait for the lift. She seemed upset. Maigret took this in silently. Another woman. No handbag, no briefcase, no perfume. Just a visitor who came and left quietly after raising her voice behind a closed door. Why didn't you mention this before? He asked. Prawn shrugged faintly. You didn't ask the right question. Maigret didn't take offense. He nodded once. Was Faber ever seen arguing with anyone else? Never. But once, I saw him staring at the wall in the stairwell, just standing there, as if listening to something on the other side. The apartment next to his, the Lemerchans, the young couple. He looked unsettled. When was this? Maybe 10 days ago, before the rain began. Maigret left the shop shortly after, thanking Prawn with a quiet nod. Outside, the rain was heavier now, turning gutters into narrow streams and flattening cigarette butts into wet blotches. The streets were half empty. He walked without hurry, letting the pieces shift in his mind. Not to solve anything, not yet, but to give the fragments room to breathe. Back at the apartment building, the light in the concierge lodge was on. Madame Chapp looked up from a small pot of potatoes she was peeling. You're back? Yes. Another tenant asked if the flat would be available soon. Some people don't even pretend to care. Death leaves spaces, Maigret murmured, and people fill them. She tilted her head. The woman he sometimes saw, she hasn't come. Do you think she will? No. She's the sort who only comes when it suits her. Maigret took this in, then looked toward the staircase. I'll speak to Madame Lemerchant again. She's in. Madame Chapp said. Her boy's napping. He climbed slowly, pausing once at Faber's door. The sealed entrance seemed more final now, not because of what lay behind it, but because of what had left it. The apartment no longer held secrets. Only echoes dotted the Lemerchans. Elise opened the door with a finger to her lips, gesturing toward the back room. He's just gone to sleep, she whispered. I won't be long. She led him to the small sitting room. Maigret stood near the window. The curtains were damp from condensation. The air smelled of soup. I wanted to ask, he said, keeping his voice low. Do you remember anyone visiting Monsieur Faber the day before he died? She frowned slightly. I didn't hear anything unusual. A woman. Her eyes narrowed slightly. There was someone. I thought it was Mademoiselle Barus, but now I'm not sure. The steps were different. Quicker, nervous. She left quickly. Yes, down the stairs, not the lift. I heard the door close hard. Did you hear any voices? Only once. A thud, like something falling. Then quiet. Maigret nodded slowly. If you remember anything else. She hesitated. He wasn't afraid. "Inspector," but he was waiting for something. Or someone, Maigret said. She didn't answer. He left quietly, back on the street. Maigret lit his pipe under a shop awning and watched a man across the road hurry through the rain. Clutching a newspaper to his chest, the city pulsed softly. Around him, oblivious to a death that no longer made noise, there were still no fingerprints, no weapon, no confession, only faint traces of emotion, clipped footsteps, two quiet afternoons, silence that spoke of arguments without words. But that was enough. It was near dusk when Maigret returned to his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, the edges of his coat damp despite the umbrella folded under his arm. The sky outside had settled into a dull pewter, and the windows caught the last sheen of day like tired mirrors. He placed his hat on the peg, lit his pipe without hurry, and sat. The folder on Vincent Faber still lay on his desk. He opened it. Again, though he knew its contents by now. Birth certificate from Lille. No known relatives in Paris. Military service marked satisfactory. Work history scattered through small publishing houses. Then freelance translation. His recent contracts with Broussac at Delaunay were routine. Legal documents. Letters of intent. Power of attorney cases. No red flags. No adversaries. No story, unless you read between the lines. He pulled the phone toward him and dialed. The voice on the other end was dry and familiar. "Lagnon, Inspector," Maigret said. "You still know people in Lille?" A pause, enough to get a few drinks or a few files. "What do you need?" "A name check. Vincent Faber. Born there, worked in Paris as a translator. I want to know what kind of life he had before he left. Neighbors, family, anything that stuck." To him, Lagnon sighed. "That the man from the courtyard?" "Yes. I don't want his records. I want the feel of him. I'll see what I can find," Lagnon replied, and hung up. Maigret sat back. The office was quiet. Outside the door, someone's typewriter clacked, too fast and uneven, a junior officer chasing a deadline. The sound irritated him, but only slightly. It wasn't the clatter of Faber's machine. That had been rhythmic, methodical. This was noise without meaning. He looked again at the note Faber had written, or perhaps hadn't meant to leave. Behind, desire can distort intention. It had the ring of something said to oneself, rather than to another. A man trying to understand his own motive, or someone else's. He thought again of the second woman, the one no one could name. The next morning, Lagnon called back. His voice sounded less bored than usual. "You were right to ask. Faber was quiet in Paris, but he left a crack in Lille." Maigret straightened in his chair. "Go on." "He taught languages there for a few years at a private college. Lived in a pension run by a Madame Colette Menard. She remembered him. Said he was polite, serious, but brittle. That was her word. Said he once had a relationship with a young woman. Briefly, intensely. It ended badly. She left town. Her name, Anne-Marie Brault." Maigret wrote it slowly. "Did she move to Paris?" "She did. About a year after the breakup. Worked in a bookstore. Then a small publishing house. Current address unknown." "Did the concierge or any tenant in Faber's building mention that name?" "No. But it's not uncommon." Maigret hung up and stared at the paper for a moment. Anne-Marie Brault. A name with no context. No face, no voice, only a position in a story that no one had told aloud. He called Lucas and asked for a discreet trace. No formal summons, no paperwork. Just find her. Where she worked, where she lived. He wanted eyes before questions. By early afternoon, Lucas returned with a file and a faint smirk. "She works in the 6th, a small editorial office on Rue des Savers. Assistant editor. Mostly handling unsolicited manuscripts. Doesn't stand out. Lives on Rue du Regard. Alone, far as we know." Maigret stood and slipped into his coat. He didn't say anything else. He arrived at the editorial office just as a clerk was locking up for lunch. Inside, the air smelled of ink and aging cardboard. A pile of rejection slips lay curled on the corner of a desk. He asked for Anne-Marie Brault and waited. She came into the room with the hesitation of someone used to bad news. She was younger than he'd expected, early 30s, but with something already worn into her posture, a guardedness. Her brown hair was tied back, simply. and her tin coat hung from her frame like a shield. When she spoke, her voice was even, but a tone lower than normal, practiced restraint. "Yes, Chief Inspector Maigret," he said. "May I speak with you for a few minutes?" She glanced toward the back of the office. "Is this about work?" "No," he said. "It's about Vincent Faber." Her face didn't fall, but her eyes lost focus for half a second. Just a flicker. "He's dead." "Yes, I heard. It was in the paper. He died in his apartment, alone." Her gaze returned to him. "And you think I had something to do with it? I think you knew him. And no one has mentioned you by name." She sat slowly. "We were close a long time ago, in Lille." "Yes, did you see him recently?" She was silent. Maigret waited. The silence did more than any question. "I went to see him," she said finally, "last week. I hadn't planned to. I was nearby and thought, perhaps foolishly, that it was time." "Time for what?" "To settle the past, or at least acknowledge it." "Did you argue?" Her mouth twitched slightly. "Yes, quietly. We never raised our voices. But it was sharp." "Why did you leave so suddenly?" She looked at her hands. "Because he said I hadn't changed, that I still hurt people without knowing it." Maigret said nothing. She continued, "I asked him if he was happy. He said happiness was no longer his concern, that he had other duties, to himself. I think he meant solitude. He believed in it, but he didn't wear it well." Maigret studied her. "Do you think he took his own life?" She looked up, startled. "No, never. That would have been surrender." "You didn't stay for tea?" "No." "You didn't touch anything in his kitchen?" She shook her head. "I didn't go past the sitting room. I didn't even take off my coat." Maigret rose. "You maybe asked more questions. I'm not accusing you, but you were the last visitor we know of." She didn't ask what would happen next. She didn't protest. Outside, the rain had stopped. The light was changing, pale and clear, like someone had cleaned the glass over the city. Maigret lit his pipe. He still didn't know who had killed Vincent Faber, but now he knew this. The past hadn't left Faber alone. The stairwell smelled faintly of damp wood and overcooked cabbage. Maigret ascended slowly, his large hand trailing along the chipped banister as he moved past Faber's former door, and toward the right staircase to the apartment of Madame Combe. It had rained again, just a thin drizzle this time, and the evening pressed in close, as if Paris had drawn a curtain over its shoulder. The light in the hallway was dim, with one bulb flickering overhead. The city felt quieter than usual, not from any special hush but from the slow weight of weather and time. Maigret knocked. A pause. The door opened a fraction, then swung fully. Madame Combe stood there in the same cardigan she'd worn to days earlier, buttoned incorrectly again. Her lips were painted, just barely, as if she'd made the effort without believing anyone would notice. Behind her, the apartment was dark except for the yellow glow of a single lamp and the blue flicker of a muted television. "Inspector," she said softly, "you've come back. I'd like to speak with you again, if I may." She stepped aside without a word. He entered. The room hadn't changed. Photographs clustered under glass. Crocheted doilies draped over the arms of an old chair, the ghost of perfume mingling with tobacco. He removed his coat and sat. She didn't ask if he wanted tea. "Did you find out who did it?" she asked, voice brittle. "Not yet." She nodded slowly, as if that answer had been expected. Maigret watched her for a moment. "You said once that he had sadness in him." "Yes." "How did you see it in his face when he wasn't aware of being watched?" "He carried something inside. A bruise, maybe." "You watched him closely." "I watch everyone. It's what you do when you're old. You watch and listen, especially when people think you don't count anymore." Maigret leaned forward slightly. "Did you ever speak to him?" "Once. He offered to help carry a parcel. That was all. I said no." "Why?" "I didn't want kindness from someone who had so little of it to spare." Maigret nodded, then tried a different line. "Did you see anyone visit him the day before he died?" She sat back and took a cigarette from a tin, lighting it with a silver lighter that trembled in her hand. "I saw a woman," she said. After exhaling, she didn't stay long. "I heard the door close too soon." "Did you know her?" She shook her head. "But I saw her once before, maybe a week earlier. She left in tears that time. Describe her. Brown hair, sharp features, carried a tan coat, didn't look like she belonged here. That wasn't Mademoiselle Barousse, no. I've seen her too. She comes with a briefcase and a cigarette already lit. Do you remember anything else? She hesitated. He had a visitor late that night, after 10. Maigret straightened. You're sure? I'm old, Inspector, not deaf. I heard someone on the stairs. They moved quickly but tried not to. I opened my door just a crack. I saw the shadow. Man or woman, I don't know. Could have been either. Slender, moving like they didn't want to be seen. Did you hear the door to his flat open? No, but 5 minutes later, I heard the same footsteps going back down. Maigret folded his hands. You didn't tell me this before. I didn't think it mattered. Now she looked at him, smoke trailing from the corner of her mouth. Now it matters, because you haven't arrested anyone yet. They sat in silence for a moment. Then she said, softly, he looked up at my window once, just once, a week before he died. I saw him in the courtyard. He stood there and looked up like he meant to say something, but he didn't. What did you think he wanted to say? I think he didn't want to die later. In the cool air of the courtyard, Maigret stood beside the stone planter where rainwater had pooled in a shallow recess. He looked up at the windows. Faber's shutters were still drawn. Madame Comb's light had gone out. The building was curling back into itself. He returned to the apartment one last time that night, not out of necessity, but instinct. The keys were still held at the precinct. He let himself in and stood just inside the doorway. The air was stale now, heavier without the man who had once given it meaning. Maigret turned on a lamp and walked to the typewriter. The page was still in place. He pulled it out and examined it again, this time not as evidence, but as expression. The precise translation of suffering is silence. He hadn't seen that before. It had been hidden behind the roller, in the lower margin. A private sentence, a confession, perhaps, not of guilt, but of weariness. He moved to the kitchen and opened the small cupboard above the sink. Rows of neatly arranged tins. Teas condensed. Milk, sugar, one tin was slightly out of line. He pulled it forward. Inside was nothing but folded tissue, and beneath it, a small brown vial. No label. Just a rubber stopper. He turned it in his hand. It didn't belong. Nothing else in the apartment was hidden. Faber was orderly, fastidious. Hiding this meant he knew what it was and what it could do. Back in the sitting room, Maigret sat in the armchair where Faber had died. He didn't lean back. He sat forward, as if preparing to stand again. The cushion gave beneath his weight, the ghost of another presence still faintly there. A second visitor. Late. Unannounced. Why return? Why after the woman had already gone? Not rage. Maigret thought. Something quieter, more patient. Someone who'd waited. Someone who had listened. And now perhaps, someone who believed they had finished something. He rose, returned the vial to the tin, and shut the cupboard. He would not call the lab yet. Not until he knew whose hands had held that glass. Outside, the rain had stopped again. But the city had not moved on. Not yet. The storm broke again the following evening, slow and deliberate. Rain moved across the city not as punishment, but as routine, turning gutters into rivers and balconies into silent witness boxes. At number 17 Rue du Marche Popincourt, the courtyard glistened once more under flickering street lamps. The building had drawn back into itself. Doors stayed closed. Windows wore reflections like veils. Maigret returned just after 8. He wore no hat this time, the rain soaking gently into his coat. His pipe was unlit in his pocket, as though smoking would feel impolite now, or premature. He nodded to Madame Chap in her lodge. She didn't ask what brought him back. She merely pointed upward, her eyes already telling him she knew something had shifted. He climbed slowly, not to Faber's flat, but beyond, to the 3rd floor right, where Madame Combe lived. He knocked once. The door opened on the second knock. The old widow stood with a candle in one hand. The electricity, she said, had flickered and then failed entirely in her part of the flat. Whether by storm or fuse, she did not know, and hadn't bothered to call anyone about it. I was expecting you, she said. He said nothing. She stepped aside. Inside, The apartment looked like a stage lit for a confession. The candlelight gave her photos depth and gave her face a strange youth, not in her skin, but in her expression, which was focused and almost shy. She placed the candle on the table and sat without asking him to do the same. Maigret remained standing. Water dripped faintly from his cuffs. "I have tea," she said. "It won't help the truth, but it might warm it. I'm not here for tea, I know." Maigret took out the small brown vial and placed it on the table between them. She looked at it but did not reach for it. "You recognize this?" he asked. "Yes. It was hidden in Faber's cupboard." She nodded. "I put it there." "When?" "The night he died." "Before or after?" "After." The room seemed to still. The candle flickered. She reached forward and turned the vial so its stopper faced her, as if realigning it might also correct the memory. "You knew he was dead when you entered?" "No," she said. "Not exactly. But I suspected." Maigret didn't interrupt. "I heard the noise, a fall, or something close. It was just past 10. I thought, at first, maybe it was nothing. But I waited. No movement, no light. So I went up. His door wasn't locked. I opened it. I found him like that, already gone." "You didn't call anyone?" "No." "You searched his kitchen?" "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him now. Her voice was calm. "Because I knew what it was. The quietness, the stillness. I saw it in his face. Not pain, not surprise, resignation. He had done it himself. So you took the vial." "I didn't want him to be judged by it." Maigret stepped closer to the table. "Why?" "Because it wasn't a crime to him. It was an end, one he had chosen. I thought maybe that deserved some dignity." "Did he say anything to you before?" "He said goodbye earlier that day. Not directly, but he looked at me differently, like someone closing a door from the inside." Maigret stared at her, measuring the cadence of her voice, the poise of her body. "You never spoke much before." "No, but I watched. We both did. He never invited you in." "No, but you went anyway, that night." "Yes." Maigret folded his arms. "There are fingerprints on the glass in the kitchen that aren't his." "Likely yours." She nodded. "I made tea, for myself, afterward." "Why?" She didn't answer at first. Then she said, "Because I didn't want him to be alone, even in death." Maigret sat. Finally, the candle between them hissed faintly, the wick curling as the wax pooled below it. "He didn't leave a note," Maigret said. "He didn't need to. He left silence. He left everything. Just so. You don't prepare like that by accident. There was a visitor earlier. A woman." "Yes," she said. "She came. She cried. She left. She didn't stay long enough. And you?" "I stayed." The words had weight. Not pride, not shame, just weight, like an anchor slowly sinking. Maigret leaned back. "You understand I can't decide based only on what you say. I know there will be questions. There always are. Some would say you tampered with a death scene, that you obstructed an investigation." She smiled faintly. "Is that worse than obstructing despair?" Maigret didn't reply. The candle danced. Outside, the rain continued. He stood, placing his large hand gently on the edge of the table. "You'll need to come with me tomorrow," he said. "Give a statement. I understand." He reached the door, then paused. "Why him?" he asked. "Why did you care?" She stared into the candle flame. "Because he was the only person I knew who kept his sadness in order, and because he reminded me of someone I used to be." He nodded once, almost as if tipping a hat that wasn't there, and stepped out into the hallway. Back in the courtyard, the sky had gone black, but the windows were still lit. Life had resumed its low hum. A cat sat on the sill above the bakery. Rainwater pooled in the drain. Maigret stood there for a moment, alone. The mystery hadn't unraveled with a scream or a confession. It had unfolded like paper in water, slowly, inevitably, softly coming apart. There had been no killer, only a man who no longer believed in tomorrow, and a woman who didn't want him to vanish alone. Morning came without fanfare, the rain having finally exhausted itself sometime during the night. The streets of Paris were washed clean, but not bright. The sky hung pale and indecisive over the rooftops, like a ceiling that hadn't yet chosen between clearing and brooding. Maigret sat in his office at the Quai des Orfèvres with a lukewarm cup of coffee, cooling at his elbow, the taste faintly metallic from a pot that had been reheated too many times. The report sat finished in front of him, neat handwriting on the final page belonged to Madame Combe. Her statement had been quiet, firm, and without embellishment. She had admitted to entering Faber's apartment. She had moved the vial. She had waited in the kitchen afterward, not to clean, not to stage, simply to sit. There was no evidence that contradicted her account. The autopsy confirmed death by a powerful sedative, one consistent with Faber's declining state. No marks on the body, no signs of ingestion by force, a clinical suicide. And yet, a quiet act of companionship afterward had almost made it look like something else. Maigret didn't mark the case closed. He didn't mark it anything. He lit his pipe and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. Lucas knocked, entered, without waiting for a reply, and stood holding a file under one arm. Still thinking about the old widow? Maigret nodded. You spoke to the prosecutor. He's content. No criminal charges. No pursuit. He was almost poetic about it. Called it a gesture of dignity misplaced in process. Lucas gave a shrug. Not often we hear that. From upstairs, Maigret didn't smile, but his eyes acknowledged the irony. What about Emery Brault? She's not involved. Left a clean trail. Never entered the flat. Not after the last visit. The concierge confirms she didn't. Come back. No connection to the vial, either. She'll stay in the files, but as a footnote. Good. Lucas hesitated at the door. Does it bother you? What, that he chose to end it? Maigret considered this. No. What bothers me is that it took us so long to hear it. Lucas didn't reply. He left quietly, shutting the door behind him. By late afternoon, Maigret found himself back on Rue du Marche Popincourt, not out of necessity, but restlessness. The rain had left the cobbled courtyard glistening like slate. The bakery door was propped open with a crate, and the scent of warm bread spilled outward. The air had taken on that strange stillness Paris sometimes adopted after long rain, not empty, not lively, just observant. Madame Chap stood by her doorway, sorting letters into a wooden rack. She looked up as he approached. No more questions, she asked. None today. He stood beside her, watching as a pair of school children dashed through the archway toward the street. You were right, he said after a pause. She stayed. Longer than we thought. I know. She meant well. She meant better than most. They were silent for a moment. Then Madame Chap asked, Did you ever learn why? Not exactly. But you believe her, yes. She nodded slowly. So it ends like that. Maigret exhaled through his nose. It usually does. He looked up at the windows. Faber's shutters remained closed, but something about them had changed. Perhaps it was the light, or the knowledge of absence. The room was empty now, in fact. It had never held very much, yet the vacancy felt heavier than its contents ever had. Madame Chap reached for a small envelope. This came today for him. Maigret accepted it. The handwriting was tidy. Belgian stamp. He recognized the sender's name. One of Faber's former clients, a literary editor in Brussels. No return address beyond the firm. He turned the envelope over in his hand. He won't read it. She said gently, No, but I might. He nodded a goodbye and walked back into the street, pocketing the letter. It was not evidence, not a clue. Just one more thing that had arrived too late. That evening, Maigret walked home rather than take the car. The air was crisp, and the city moved without rushing. At a small café along the Canal Saint-Martin, he paused under the awning and took a seat. He ordered a beer and lit his pipe. A thin column of smoke rose slowly, vanishing into the early dusk. He didn't read the letter. He didn't need to. Some things weren't meant to be solved, not in the way the law required. Faber had left no trail of enemies. He hadn't written a final cry for help or justice. He had ended things with order, with quiet, and with a kind of strange grace. His death had not come from conflict, but from the long accumulation of loneliness, doubt, and waiting, and the widow had simply refused to let that moment pass. Without witness. It was not the kind of case the press would cover. There were no chases, no villains, only a man who had stopped moving, and another who had noticed. Maigret drank slowly. Across the canal, a couple leaned against the railing, speaking in low tones. A cyclist passed. A small dog barked, and a waiter scolded it in a whisper. The world, Maigret thought, had resumed. It always did. But for some, like Faber, it had simply never started again. The inspector sat there until the glass was empty and the pipe cold. Then he rose, settled his coat around his shoulders, and walked the long way home. Not because he had somewhere to go, but because sometimes after the rain, walking was enough. A week had passed. Spring had begun to assert itself, gently but unmistakably. The rains had tapered off into a light drizzle that passed quickly, leaving behind streets washed clean, trees budding hesitantly, and the smell of damp stone replaced by earth and pollen. Paris moved on, as it always did, not with fanfare, but with small shifts in rhythm. The corner cafes opened their awnings again. The boulangeries began to bake with windows open. Life resumed. At number 17 Rue du Marche Popincourt, the courtyard had quieted. The sealed door to Faber's apartment was now unsealed, not occupied, not yet, but cleared of his presence. The official stamp from the notary had come down. The widow had not claimed anything, nor had Faber's former acquaintances. The property was being inventoried by the city. In time, it would be rented again. No trace of the man would remain. Maigret stood in the courtyard late one afternoon, leaning lightly on his umbrella, not for the rain, which had held off, but for balance. He had come not to investigate, nor to question, but to mark something unspoken, a return, a kind of silent respect. His presence here was unannounced, unnecessary, and perhaps unwelcome, but he had learned that some ends demanded a second visit. Above, the windows were open. Somewhere a piano played, a child practicing scales with the patient imprecision of youth. He recognized the pattern, E clementi sonatina, he thought. The sound echoed softly down the stairwell. It did not disturb the peace it gave it. Texture dot from the far end of the courtyard, Madame Chap emerged. She no longer wore her apron, just a cardigan and scarf. She didn't seem surprised to see him. "You've come again," she said. Double quotes yes. She nodded and folded her hands in front of her. "The Lemerchans are expecting a second child. Already, life keeps going." He looked up again at the third floor. "No one's taken the flat yet," she added. "There've been inquiries, but I think the walls are still listening." Maigret smiled faintly. "That's not so common. People listening to walls." "No," she said, "but it used to be." A brief silence passed between them. She lit a cigarette, carefully shielding the flame from the breeze. "What happened to the widow?" she asked. She gave her statement. The magistrate considered. Her action inappropriate, but not criminal. No prosecution. Good. She didn't act for herself. That made the difference. Madame Chap exhaled. "She's quiet. Hasn't left her apartment much. I think she feels the absence more than the presence ever meant." Maigret nodded. "That's often how it is." He turned to leave, then hesitated. "There's a line," he said, "from something Faber wrote. I don't think he meant it for anyone, but I read it anyway." "What did it say?" "The precise translation of suffering is silence." Madame Chap didn't reply for a long time. Then, softly, "Yes, that sounds like him." He left her then and stepped back into the street. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, his office had been tittied in his absence. A new stack of case files waited on the edge of his desk. Thefts, a suspected arson, a domestic dispute that might have turned fatal. The usual ebb and flow of human conflict. He ignored them for the moment. Instead, he turned once more to the envelope Madame Chap had handed him days ago. The letter sent too late. He had not opened it then. He opened it now. Inside was a note from Faber's former client in Brussels, polite, formal. It asked for revisions to a draft translation and included a few marginal notes. "Please let me know if you are available," it said. "It would be good to collaborate again." The letter was dated 2 days before Faber died. Maigret refolded it and slipped it back into its envelope. There had been, even then, a possibility, a path forward, but Faber hadn't taken it. Maigret didn't judge him for that. Some men carried wounds too deep to be reopened, even by kindness. The next morning, Maigret found himself in a small cafe on the left bank. Not his usual place, not near the office, but one he used when he wanted to be nobody. The waiters didn't know him. The clientele didn't glance twice. The coffee was poor, but the solitude excellent. He sat at a table near the window, watching the street begin its day. A man swept the curb with a wide broom. A girl with a red satchel waited for the light to change. Nothing remarkable, but peaceful. From his coat, he drew the last page from Faber's typewriter, the page left half-written. It was not a diary entry, not a confession, perhaps the beginning of an article, or the preface to something private. But Maigret read it now not for evidence, but for atmosphere, to hear the voice behind the silence. We convince ourselves that words will preserve us, that meaning, once found, will guard against loss. But meaning is fluid, and time wears down even the clearest phrases. What remains, in the end, is tone, the sound beneath the language. He folded it again and placed it in his breast pocket. The sound beneath the language. That was what he had followed. Not clues, not motives, but mood, nuance, pause. He had walked behind a man's silence until it opened, not into a secret, but into understanding. He finished his coffee and left coins on the table outside. The sky had cleared, but puddles still caught the light. Paris was in motion again, the small, constant motion of lives brushing past one another without quite touching. Somewhere a horn honked. Somewhere else, a radio played something melancholy. Maigret turned up his collar and walked toward the Seine. Behind him, the cafe door swung shut. And ahead, not an answer, but an acceptance. The letter sat on Maigret's desk for 3 more days. He didn't touch it again. He didn't need to. Its content was known. A request for collaboration, for routine work, from a past that hadn't yet guessed it was no longer welcome. A simple envelope that had arrived too late. The kind of late that didn't shout, didn't even whisper. It simply was, like an unplayed note in a silent room. Faber had received it, Maigret believed, or had seen it arrive and placed it aside. Perhaps it had given him pause. Perhaps it had meant nothing at all. Some men drown slowly over time. Others step calmly into the deep. That afternoon, Maigret stood once more in the rain-darkened hallway of Madame Combes' apartment. This time, she opened the door before he knocked. She wore her cardigan properly buttoned. Her face was calm. "I expected you," she said. "You always do." She stepped aside. The room was unchanged, though the candle on the table had been replaced with a vase of wilting irises. They sat without formality. Outside, a bird chattered from a rooftop. "He didn't leave a letter," she said quietly. "But he left something." She rose, opened a drawer, and returned with a small slip of paper. "I found it behind the radiator in the hallway. Slipped. There, perhaps dropped, or maybe placed intentionally. I meant to bring it to you, but I wasn't sure when." Maigret took the note. It was only a few lines. Faber's handwriting, small, angled, spare. "It is not cowardice to go quietly. Some lives grow smaller, not louder. If anyone finds this, let them know I was not afraid. Only done, no plea, no apology, no name, a final line, unsigned." Maigret folded the paper and placed it in his coat. "That was his confession," she said. "No, that was his farewell." She nodded once. "You understand, of course," he added, "that what you did could have cost you." "I know." "Why did you do it?" She stared at her hands. "Because there are men who cannot ask to be remembered, and someone has to remember them anyway." Maigret let out a long breath, almost a sigh, but not quite. There was nothing more to investigate, nothing more to charge. Faber had lived without scandal, had died without spectacle. The puzzle had not been how, but why. And even that now had a shape, if not a full name. He stood. She did too. "I'll keep the paper," he said. "Good." He reached the door, but before he stepped out, he turned. "One question." She raised her eyebrows. "When you sat in his kitchen that night, after, what did you think?" She hesitated, then answered in a voice almost too quiet to hear. "I thought he looked peaceful. For the first time since he arrived here." Weeks passed. Spring deepened. Faber's flat was cleared, repainted, raylet. A young couple moved in. University lecturers, quiet and eager. They didn't ask about the previous tenant. No one told them. The building absorbed them without comment. Madame Combe returned to her walks in the courtyard, to the lacework in her window, to her quiet watching. She and Maigret never spoke again. In his office, Maigret filed the case, not under murder, not under accident, but under closed with cause. A rare label, a rare understanding. He thought of Faber only occasionally and never with judgment. He thought of silence, its weight, its shape, and the people who live inside it. One evening, walking home with his coat collar turned up and the scent of rain rising from the pavement, Maigret passed a bookstore. In the window sat a translation Faber had once done, a modest volume of Russian short stories. He stepped inside, bought a copy, and said nothing to the clerk. That night, over coffee, he opened the book and found Faber's introduction. Just one line: to translate is to believe there is meaning, worth carrying. Maigret closed the book. Sometimes that was enough.